Well, for more on this, our guest tonight is Eric Ruben, a law professor at SMU Dedman School in Dallas, Texas. Thank you very much for joining us tonight on the program. I just want to start by a statistic here. There have been 212 mass shootings so far in the US this year, and no meaningful gun control reform in sight. Have Americans simply resigned themselves to living with this kind of violence?
Well, I think that, in fact, there's a supermajority of Americans who do want to see some gun control. Upwards toward 90% of Americans, for instance, want to expand background checks before somebody could purchase a firearm. There's also support for red flag laws that could remove firearms from somebody who is showing a threat to themselves or to others, including in the context of mass shootings. These have been invoked. So there's support for gun regulation, but one of the things that we witness time and again is that there's paralysis at the political level. Politicians are in a stalemate, and Republicans, especially the national political level, tend to have a knee-jerk reaction against any laws that might limit or restrict the ability to get guns.
Why is the reaction to gun control so visceral among a portion of the American population?
Well, I think that story goes back many decades. It might, in fact, go back all the way into the 1980s when the National Rifle Association and the issue of gun control started to come up more frequently. And the Republican Party in particular aligned itself quite closely to the National Rifle Association. The NRA will rate politicians on a scale from A to F. And if a politician doesn't do well on that rating, there's a good chance that someone else might beat them in a primary or in the general election. And so there's incredible power within the gun rights movement and gun rights advocates.
Now, speaking of the gun rights movement, the NRA calls itself a civil rights organization. They're, of course, talking about the Second Amendment, which dates back over 230 years, and it guarantees the right to keep and bear arms. But President Biden yesterday said that this constitutional right to own weapons is not absolute and never was. What's your take on this?
So no constitutional right is absolute. There is no unfettered right, whether it's the right to free speech or the right to religion or the right to keep and bear arms. That's not how constitutional law works. And since the famous 2008 decision in the United States, District of Columbia v. Heller, which found for the first time an individual right to have a handgun in the home for self-defense, judges of all stripes, both conservative and liberal, have upheld gun laws challenged on the basis of the Second Amendment. So I'm aware of no case, for instance, where expanded background checks have been struck down, and a lot of other types of gun reform that you hear talked about here don't really present a Second Amendment issue so much as they present a political issue.
Now, there are fears at the moment that because of the conservative bent of the Supreme Court, that gun laws and gun control could actually be loosened even further, that these rights, these Second Amendment rights, could even be expanded. What would that actually look like?
Well, there's a case right now before the Supreme Court. It rises out of New York, and it's a challenge to a century-old New York law that requires an applicant to carry a handgun in public to show that they have a heightened need for self-defense. And the challengers weren't able to satisfy that standard. So right now, the Supreme Court is considering whether or not it's unconstitutional to require an adult who otherwise would be able to carry a handgun in public to show that they have good cause in order to carry a lethal weapon in public. And a lot of court watchers think that the court is going to strike that down. I think that this case does signal that this current Supreme Court is more gun-friendly than past Supreme Courts, perhaps more gun-friendly than any Supreme Court in this country's history. So it is possible that we start seeing more gun laws struck down, but only time will tell.
Now, you've said that a majority of Americans actually want background checks. They want to make it harder for people to get their hands on weapons. Do you think this is going to happen? Because given that the majority of what people want seem to clash with what the politicians want, how can anyone really affect any kind of lasting change?
Only time will tell here. Look, there hasn't been any significant federal gun regulation since the 1990s. You'd have to go back a quarter of a century. So anything that comes out of this Congress would be a big deal. And one of the things they're considering is expanded background checks. But if the aftermath of Sandy Hook is any indication, I'm not going to hold my breath. After Sandy Hook, there also was a bipartisan bill to expand background checks so that anyone couldn't just go and engage in a secondary sale to get a firearm. And ultimately, it failed after the murder of 26 individuals and children in that case. So perhaps things have changed. There is a stronger gun safety movement now than there was back then. And perhaps the senators will be able to come together and agree on some modest incremental reforms.
Okay, Eric Ruben, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for speaking to us here on France 24.
Thanks for having me on.